This video tutorial is all about the fight or flight response. Now, often the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system work together in parallel, for example, during a stressful event. The fight or flight response is a sequence of activity within the body that is triggered when the body prepares itself for either defending or attacking, so that's in fighting, or running away to safety, so flighting. The activity involves changes in the nervous system and the endocrine system. And as a result, it's quite a good opportunity for examiners to test your knowledge of both systems simultaneously. Now, you need to be familiar with the main physiological changes that are associated with the fight or flight response, and also the survival value of each of these changes. So, for example, pupil dilation, that's going to allow more light to enter the eye, making the retina more sensitive. Heart rate and blood pressure increases, they're going to increase the amount of blood flow to deliver more oxygen and glucose to the muscles and also remove carbon dioxide and other toxins. And we'll see raises in blood glucose levels. That's to supply more energy for muscular contraction. You'll have a greater sort of ventilation rate and depth of ventilation increasing to increase gas exchange so that more oxygen can enter the blood and supply aerobic respiration. And also things like endorphins in the brain, which are natural painkillers, are going to be released. And that's so that if a wound is inflicted during that fight mode on the mammal, then that's not going to prevent any further activity, any further fighting response. Now, here we see a diagram that's essentially summarizing the action of the hypothalamus and the coordination of the fight and flight response. Receptors can detect external threat. So, for example, the eyes, the ears, and nose are all going to be able to detect external threats in our environment. We have internal receptors as well that might detect threat, such as pain receptors, and we might also be able to detect changes in blood pressure, which would enable us to detect that threat. An area of the brain called the cerebrum uses that sensory input to coordinate a suitable response. So inputs feed into sensory receptors in the cerebrum. The cerebrum then passes signals to the associated centers. And if a threat is recognized, the cerebrum will stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will then increase activity of the sympathetic nervous system, as well as stimulating the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So in the diagram in front of you, you can see a summary essentially of the effects of the hypothalamus. So the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and we then see activation of the adrenal medulla, which is going to be responsible for releasing adrenaline into the blood. We also see activation of glands and smooth muscle. And then in addition, on the sort of right-hand side, we see activation of the adrenal cortical system as a result of a release of a hormone CRF, which in turn is going to stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete ACTH. And ACTH arrives at the adrenal cortex and will be responsible for the release of many, many more hormones into the bloodstream, all of which are going to help coordinate this fight or flight response. Now, because adrenaline is central to the fight or flight response, it's important that we just run through again how a hormone like adrenaline can act, its sort of main signaling pathway. Now, we have covered this before, so hopefully this is revision for you. So adrenaline is a first messenger. It's an amino acid derivative and is therefore unable to enter the target cell. It must cause an effect inside the cell without entering the cell itself. So adrenaline binds to the adrenaline receptor on the plasma membrane. The receptor is associated with a G protein on the inner surface of the plasma membrane, which is stimulated to activate the enzyme adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase converts ATP into cyclic AMP, which is the second messenger inside the cell. Cyclic AMP will then cause a cascade of chemical reactions within the cell, and exactly what effects that's going to have will depend upon the cell and its particular action.